should you start a podcast? Especially if you're a business owner, you have probably had the thought, I should start a podcast. So the question is, should you actually start one? In a world where we literally have thousands and thousands of podcasts to choose from, thousands of creators are uploading podcasts, and you have thousands of episodes that are hitting your feed on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or wherever you're listening to, or even YouTube, even more so, then you might be thinking like, this is a red ocean. There's way too many podcasts out there. There's too many creators that are creating podcasts, and there's can't be that many people that are listening to podcasts in order for me to be able to get in front of them and actually have interest in listening to me. So I'm going to kind of tell you the differences between like if you should start one or not. The first thing I always point to is, what is your objective for starting the podcast? I've talked to people, they come to me and they say, I want to start a podcast, Josh. And I say, that's great. Why do you want to start it? And they just say, well, I just want to do it as a passion project, or I feel like I've always wanted to do one. And I stop them right there. The reason is because you got to remember, when it comes to podcasting, it takes commitment for time and for money as well. Because chances are you're going to be, even if you edit the podcast yourself and put it out yourself, you're doing everything yourself because you want to save a little bit of money, you're still kind of taking away from the resources of which you could spend your time on. So you're spending your time and resources on the editing of the podcast, specifically you doing it, as opposed to being able to outsource it to somebody else. So the other thing is, if you do outsource it to an organization like ours, we manage and edit podcasts, then you are going to be spending a little bit of money to do that. Now, here's the thing. When it comes to podcast editing, there's a few things that really get into the nitty-gritties where you're editing the audio, the video, the show noting, the distribution, all that stuff. We're not going to talk about that on this episode today, but I really want to go back into the thought process of, well, should I start one because it's a red ocean, because there's so many podcasts out there? And again, I always go back to the question of why you're starting it. If you are a business owner, primarily I work with business owners. Well, not primarily, 100% I work with business owners. But even if you are somebody that maybe you want to start it, you don't own a business, maybe you just have an interest in something, maybe you want to start a podcast on music, or you want to start a podcast reviewing sneakers or whatever it is, the question would always be why? Because you are going to have a commitment. And when it comes to the podcast game, doing it for a long period of time is highly important. Typically, when I enter a podcast agreement with a client, I tell them, have no expectations until we get at least 50 episodes in. Until you hit 50 episodes, you have no shot of having any kind of big traction and success on your podcast. Now, I do know of a few people that are out there that have this method to be able to launch a podcast and you immediately hit the ground running. You can rank within the first couple episodes and that sort of thing. You can rank 1 or 2 in the first couple episodes and that sort of thing. That costs a lot of money. So let's just assume you don't have the capital to be able to spend thousands of dollars on that kind of a system to rank your podcast. You want to go in at it, you want to start it, and you want to do it. You're in for it for the long run, right? That's the assumption that we're kind of stapling in here. So if you're a business owner and you're wanting to start a podcast, of course, the objective is going to be to generate leads, to generate connections, to generate an audience. It's not going to be a thing of like social media. We're going to have thousands of subscribers on a weekly basis that are going to come to you and watch your videos and that sort of thing. So, subscribers on podcasts, it can be kind of difficult to generate those if you don't do it correctly. But the most important thing is executing the fundamentals, which we'll do another episode on my YouTube channel of the fundamentals of creating a podcast and making sure it goes out correctly. But as long as you're executing the fundamentals, you're staying consistent with it, and you're putting the proper volume out there, then generally speaking, you will weed yourself out if you do it for a year or 50 plus episodes at a time. Because what happens is, you don't know how many people I know personally, and I don't know personally, that have started a podcast. They got 5 to 10 episodes deep. They realize the commitment level that it takes, the time that it takes, and then they decide, I don't really want to do this. It's not generating ROI. But guys, that's not the podcast path. That's not what happens with podcasting. Yes, you can make money in podcasting. Yes, you can generate leads in podcasting, but it takes time to get to that destination. So it's important to understand it's a commitment off the bat to make sure you're going to put out 50 to 100 episodes before you start judging it and deciding, I'm going to cap this or I'm going to continue on. That's an extremely important point to make. So the number one thing I would point to is, does your audience listen to podcasts? If your audience does listen to podcasts, then, and it makes sense for your business, and it's something where you can use it as a platform or a medium in order to be able to get good content in front of your audience and generate leads, then yes, start the podcast. And that's where you're going to go from there. Now, again, I want to go back to if the intentionality is to generate leads, then you're using it as marketing. You're not trying to create this podcast because you're becoming a podcaster. You're creating the podcast to use it as a marketing tool to generate leads. Another thing I like to really leverage podcasts for is to get high-level connections on my podcast as a guest. I want to be able to build relationships. You don't know how many relationships I've been able to build. And ultimately working with clients or bringing somebody in to have some sort of an opportunity with them that I've generated just by asking somebody to be a guest on my show, or vice versa, me making an appearance on their show. That's one of the best utilizations for a podcast. So if you are a B2B business owner and you're starting a podcast, intentionally get guests on the show that you could potentially make good relationship with and have opportunities with, maybe partner with something on a deal, or you actually work with them, you service them because you're a service provider or whatever it is. I work with real estate investors on their social media, podcasts, and YouTube. So I'll intentionally get people that I personally don't know, but I know have a good reputation on my podcast. And I'll talk to them on that podcast about working with me or potentially being able to partner in some way. And there's been a lot of really, really great opportunities that have come out of that. So again, the number one thing that I would really staple in is, does your audience listen to podcasts? My audience absolutely listens to podcasts. They absolutely consume YouTube content like this. You are my audience if you're watching this right now. And if you're watching my social media videos, you are my audience there. It's important. Like if I know that people will watch social media videos to consume my content, that's where I'm going to put it out. It's no different than with a book. If you're an author and you're writing a book, or maybe you have a business and you're like, should I write a book for this? The question I would first start off with is, does my audience read books? Because there are audiences that don't read books. And it's important to understand your audience, Marketing 101, better than they know themselves. That's highly important. So if you don't know their tendencies, first start there, then come back to this video. But if your audience does listen to podcasts and you're marketing your business and that's the intentionality of it, start a podcast. And I think that you can really go in and do some really, really good things with a podcast. It's a lot of advantages starting a podcast. For instance, if you do a video podcast, which you should, there's a lot of abilities to be able to take that content, chop it up, and use it for social media. I've even written books just on podcast episodes, where if you actually look for my book, the REI Marketing Book, that book is literally a combination of about 50 episodes that we transcribed and then rewrote some of the transcriptions and put it into a book, and I sold it as a free plus shipping offer and generated a lot of relationships and leads with that source. So there's a lot of advantages to a podcast. Really, if you're watching this video, chances are you're on the fence. You're thinking like, should I start one? Should I not start one? And it's simple. If your audience consumes podcasts, you have the time for it, and it makes sense for your business to start a podcast in order to be able to generate leads, then I would start a podcast. There's a lot of benefits to it. And once again, as long as you're executing the structure and the strategies correctly from the start and staying consistent with it, then it will generate results for you. So I want to make one more point going back to one of my first things I said was the biggest, thing that pushes people to not do a podcast is this is a red ocean. There's way too many out there. Here's the thing. There's a reason there's way too many out there. It's because there's a massive audience of people that listen to podcasts. There is an audience for it. And the way that you stick out is by just staying consistent with it over time and putting out really, really good content and focusing on the quality, not just the production quality. That is important. And that will help you stand out, is if you're recording it well, if you're videoing it well, and that sort of thing, that will help you stand out. But as long as you're delivering great information and you're delivering great value, then that will help you stand out in the pack of podcasters. And then over time, if you do 50 to 100 episodes and you stay consistent with that, again, that alone will put you in the top 5 to 10% of podcasters that are out there, because people will start podcasts and quit. I can't tell, like literally, there are more people I know that have started a podcast and quit somewhere in there, and as opposed to people that have started a podcast and are still doing it 2 to 3 years later. And it's just because they know that the consistency does work. When it comes to organic podcasting, it does work. Now, we'll do a whole nother video on how to promote your podcast and get it out there and make sure it's getting in front of the amount of people that you wanted to get in front of, or the right people, the right audiences. But that's a whole nother video. Today, I wanted to make sure that you got nailed down if you are going to start one or not. If you're still kind of on the fence and you'd like to connect with me, there are just, some links down in the description below to be able to connect with me. You can send me a direct message on Instagram or Facebook. I'd be more than happy to connect with anybody and really learn about your story and why you want to start a podcast and help you give some direction on if you should actually start one or not, because I know it's a big question in a lot of people's mind. A lot of people want to start podcasts. They're just not sure if they should or not because of all the reasons that I stated here. So hopefully that helps somebody, gave some direction. If you have any questions, you can also leave comments down below in the video. I do respond to every single comment personally. I don't have somebody else doing it. I do it personally. So leave a comment down below if you have any further questions about starting a podcast. But thank you guys for watching. If you haven't already, make sure you subscribe, like this video, and share it with somebody that you know that might potentially need it. Catch you on the next one. See ya.